The sacred texts don't merely tell tales of faith, divine interventions, and fulfilled prophecies. They also uncover the ancient roots of struggles that have endured across generations, struggles that continue echoing powerfully throughout our modern world. When we dive deep into these narratives, we encounter characters and choices that didn't just shape entire people's identities, but also determined the course of human history itself. What exactly drove Jews and Arabs, nations sharing identical origins, into such an extended, such an intense, such a historically charged rivalry? What hidden truths lie beneath their interconnected stories? Why do they remain entangled in tensions, wars, and battles over territory, inheritance, and divine promises even after countless centuries? Scripture doesn't only provide answers about bygone eras. It also offers insight into that many current struggles have spiritual foundations, that contemporary wars and divisions actually originated from decisions made thousands of years ago, often guided by human impatience or misunderstanding of divine promises. If these topics spark questions within you, if you want to understand not just what happened but why it happened and what it means for us today, stay until the end. If you're finding value in this content, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We don't just tell you what occurred, we show you why it still matters today. This video isn't merely history, it's revelation. It's spiritual understanding that can transform how you perceive our current world. Get ready for a journey that extends far beyond ancient history. We're about to explore the depths of a promise that didn't just mark one man's destiny, but continues shaping relationships between peoples, cultures, and entire nations today. Because both war and peace, though we view them through modern eyes, have very ancient roots, roots that sink deep into divine covenants, painful waiting periods, human mistakes, and also the unshakable faithfulness of a God who never forgets what he promises. Before we begin, I invite you as always to support us with a like and write in the comments which country or city you're watching from. We love knowing how far this word reaches. Now, let's enter together into this story that changed everything. In the midst of vast, silent lands of the ancient Mesopotamian desert, during an era dominated by false gods, pagan worship, and tribal structures, occurred a calling that would shatter all known patterns. In that time when men sought power and recognition through warfare or offspring, God set his eyes upon an ordinary man, without fame, without army, without throne. His name was Abraham. He possessed no noble titles, no ostentatious wealth, no outstanding social position, but he had something that caught the attention of the universe's creator, an obedient heart willing to believe the incredible. It was to him that God made a promise that would alter the entire course of human history. Chapter 12, verse 2, the Lord said, "I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you, make your name great, and you will be a blessing." This wasn't symbolic language or simple spiritual inspiration. It was a real covenant, an eternal commitment between God and a man who accepted leaving everything to walk by faith. This promise drew the first lines of a story of lineage, faith, struggle, and redemption that would extend generation after generation. Abraham years later. An older man with wrinkles marked not only by time's passage but by trials he had endured. He lived in a culture where the ability to have children wasn't just a gift. It was also a symbol of blessing, honor, security, and family prestige. But he and his wife, Sarah, had spent years facing a harsh and painful reality. They couldn't conceive. Each year without pregnancy was like another stone upon their shoulders. Every glance of compassion or judgment from others, every uncomfortable conversation, every silent night, everything was a constant reminder of a promise that still hadn't been fulfilled. Infertility in that culture wasn't just a medical condition. It was viewed as a curse, as a sign that something was wrong. And that cut deeply. Sarah, like Abraham, had a weary heart. Hope was weakening, and the long, inexplicable wait was transforming into suffering. Faith in the promise remained there, but accompanied by questions, tears, and nights of uncertainty. How could God promise offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven if they couldn't even have one child? Yet in the midst of that emotional desert where faith battled against time's passage and promises seemed to evaporate like morning dew, the divine seed remained alive. It hadn't been extinguished, hadn't been forgotten. Though reality screamed that everything was impossible, something within Abraham and Sarah continued sustaining them. It was a fragile flame, yes, but still burning. The promise God had given them wasn't just any promise, it was a declaration of eternal purpose. He had told them that from them would come an uncountable people, more numerous than sea sand or heaven's stars, a complete nation, born from a womb that until then had borne no fruit. That hope burned in their hearts, but years passed and the promise didn't come. The waiting became a burden. At first, faith was enough, but with each birthday, each full moon, each glance at Sarah's flat belly, doubt grew stronger. What if they hadn't understood correctly? What if God had forgotten? What if it was too late? Sarah's barrenness, which once was only a medical concern, became over time an emotional wound that bled silently. Each new menstrual cycle was like a sentence, a cruel voice saying, "You won't be a mother." And in a culture where woman's worth was largely measured by her ability to bear children, Sarah felt empty, nullified, useless. Sadness began clouding hope, and when hope is exhausted, the mind starts seeking shortcuts. It was then that Sarah began considering the unthinkable. Looking at her era's customs, she remembered it was culturally acceptable for a barren woman to give her servant to her husband to conceive through her. It was a social solution, not spiritual, but it was what norms dictated, and in her desperation, it seemed logical. So, on an afternoon heavy with silence and resignation, Sarah took a step that would mark humanity's history. She approached Abraham. Her face showed no joy. There was pain, she said, there was muted but firm voice, but there was also determination. "The Lord has prevented me from having children. Take my servant Hagar. Perhaps through her I can build a family." It was a proposal born from brokenness, not faith, but in her human logic it made sense. In that tribal world, having descendants was fundamental for clan survival. It was a matter of continuity, inheritance, power. And if Sarah's womb bore no fruit, then using another woman's womb seemed rare, to many a sensible strategy. Illegal. It was common practice among nomadic peoples. Hagar, the Egyptian servant, was available. She was young, fertile, obedient, and in Sarah's eyes she represented the only door that remained open. But what seemed a reasonable exit soon transformed into the entrance to deep conflict. Because when human beings attempt with their own hands to fulfill what only God can do, consequences always multiply. What was about to unleash wasn't just a pregnancy. It was a chain of tensions, wounds, and rivalries that would traverse generations. What was born from that decision wasn't merely a son, but a story of division that would mark the world until today. Abraham stepped forward convinced that by accepting his wife's proposal, he would be collaborating with the fulfillment of that divine promise which had hung over his life for years like a sacred cloud. Perhaps, he thought, if this is the way, so be it. Maybe it was from love for Sarah, from not wanting to see her suffer anymore, or perhaps it was from exhaustion, from that spiritual weariness that comes when one has waited too long for something that doesn't finish arriving. But that step, far from bringing relief, unleashed a storm, a chain of consequences that neither Abraham nor Sarah, much less Hagar, could have imagined. What should have been a practical solution became an open wound that infected the heart of that family chosen by God. When Hagar became pregnant and her belly began growing, the atmosphere within the home changed radically. The house, which before shared the silence of waiting, was now full of invisible tensions. Hagar's pregnancy, which for Sarah represented the possibility of finally having a son, even if, through another, transformed into a painful mirror that reminded her at every instant what she couldn't achieve by herself. Hagar, before simply a servant without voice or privilege, began walking differently. Her gaze toward Sarah was no longer submissive, but charged with certain superiority. Now she carried the patriarch's child. And that in a culture like theirs was synonymous with power, status, worth. Sarah, seeing that attitude, was swallowed by an emotional whirlwind. She felt displaced, humiliated, invisible. Jealousy began consuming her from within like a slow but constant fire. What had started as a solution ended up becoming a source of resentment, pride, and bitterness. And that house where blessing was expected became an emotional battlefield. Even when our intentions seem good, intervening outside God's perfect timing can open doors to pain, division, and consequences lasting for generations. Sarah, broken inside and blinded by her pain, began mistreating Hagar harshly. It wasn't passing anger, it was cruel, constant treatment that ended up breaking the young Egyptian's spirit. Hagar saw no other option but to flee. She escaped to the desert, taking not only her tired body, she wasn't just also a wounded heart and a womb. She was making a desperate retreat from a situation that was suffocating her. She sought peace. She sought relief. Perhaps she sought to die. But what she found was something much greater, because that desert, that inhospitable place where no one goes by choice, wasn't her end. It was her altar. There, in the middle of nowhere, alone and on the verge of collapse, Hagar was found by a heavenly messenger. An angel sought her where no one else would. And that angel didn't come to judge her, didn't come to punish her. He came to console her, came to give her direction, hope, and restoration. The celestial messenger spoke to her with profound tenderness about her unborn son, assuring her with divine authority that she wasn't walking this treacherous path alone, that the Almighty had witnessed every moment of her suffering and affliction, that the child growing within her womb wasn't some cosmic accident or devastating mistake, but rather an integral piece of the eternal divine tapestry. God made a sacred covenant with Hagar in that desolate place, promising with unshakable certainty that the child she carried would become the founding father of a mighty and influential nation. With that heavenly promise, he didn't merely restore her physical strength to make the journey back to Abraham's camp. He returned something far more precious: her dignity, her sense of worth, her understanding that she mattered in the grand scheme of eternity. That supernatural encounter beneath the scorching desert sun wasn't simply another celestial apparition recorded in ancient texts. It represented a complete watershed moment, a divine intervention that penetrated the very core of her being, transforming her from the inside out through an intimate, profound, and utterly life-changing spiritual metamorphosis. Hagar, who until that pivotal moment had viewed herself as nothing more than a despised slave, used by her masters and then carelessly discarded like a broken vessel, suddenly found herself completely embraced and cherished by the loving, all-seeing gaze of the Creator himself. The Most High didn't just stumble upon her in her moment of desperation. He deliberately sought her out, saw her true value, recognized her pain, and that divine recognition changed absolutely everything about how she understood herself and her place in his plan. From that transformative moment forward, Hagar was no longer merely the nameless Egyptian servant who existed in the shadows of Abraham's household. She made the journey back to Abraham's sprawling camp with her head held proudly high, her shoulders squared with newfound confidence, with brilliant new light dancing in her eyes, and with her faith completely and thoroughly restored from its previous shattered state. She didn't return as a defeated woman limping back with her tail between her legs. Instead, she returned as someone fundamentally strengthened, fortified by divine encounter and heavenly assurance. She was no longer just another woman desperately fleeing from cruel mistreatment and harsh circumstances beyond her control. Now she had been transformed into something far more significant. A mother carrying within her womb a precious heavenly promise. A woman who had been personally marked, chosen, and blessed by the infinite love and boundless compassion of the God who always listens to the cries of the broken-hearted and never turns his back on those who call upon his name in their darkest hours. Though the oppressive atmosphere within Sarah's tent remained thick and charged with unspoken tension, simmering resentment, and barely contained hostility, Hagar herself was no longer the same frightened, broken woman who had fled into the wilderness months before. Now, with each precious heartbeat of her promised son pulsing rhythmically within her growing womb, with each gentle movement and playful little kick that reminded her of the life flourishing inside her, she felt the deep emotional pain and trauma of her past experiences slowly but surely transforming into divine purpose and eternal significance. She came to understand with crystal clarity that every tear she had shed in that lonely desert place hadn't been wasted or forgotten. They had all been collected by a loving God who sees everything. Within her expanding belly wasn't just another human life taking shape. There was an entire story being written, a living testimony that would forever prove that the Almighty listens intently to the desperate cries of the afflicted and downtrodden, that he sees clearly those whom society has rejected and cast aside, and that he never, ever forgets about the invisible ones whom the world chooses to overlook. Ismael wouldn't simply be just another ordinary child born into difficult circumstances. He would become her personal miracle, her living proof of God's faithfulness, a breathing reminder that her anguished cry in the wilderness hadn't fallen into empty void, that her crushing solitude had been dramatically interrupted by the clear, comforting voice of heaven's messenger, and that her story, though completely ignored and dismissed by earthly men, was intimately known, carefully recorded, and deeply cherished in the eternal courts of heaven. And when the long-awaited day finally arrived and Ismael was born into the world, the overwhelming joy that filled the camp was absolutely undeniable and impossible to contain. Abraham received his son with completely sincere happiness and unrestrained celebration, like a father who had waited decades and finally witnessed the arrival of a tangible piece of the divine promise he had been patiently expecting for countless years. The sacred text of Genesis 16:15 records this momentous occasion with beautiful simplicity, telling us, "And Hagar bore Abraham a son, and Abraham called the name of the son whom Hagar bore him Ismael." That carefully chosen name, Ismael, which carries the profound meaning "God has heard," wasn't selected randomly or given by mere coincidence. It stood as a resounding declaration that echoed through the ages, an eternal affirmation and unshakable testimony that the deepest sighs and desperate cries from broken, shattered hearts do indeed reach the throne room of heaven and capture the attention of the Almighty. That small, seemingly defenseless infant already carried within his tiny frame a magnificent destiny that would unfold over generations. His very name served as a banner of hope flying proudly over a broken world, his mere existence providing undeniable proof that the Creator doesn't require a perfect, unblemished lineage or ideal circumstances to accomplish His mighty works with supernatural power. The God of the universe listens to our prayers, He acts on our behalf, and He always responds in His perfect timing. But as so often happens in the complex, messy tapestry of human stories filled with imperfect people and competing desires, the initial joy and celebration didn't last forever for everyone involved in this unfolding drama. Ismael's birth, rather than bringing the hoped-for unity and peace to Abraham's household, instead stirred up long-dormant emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Sarah, observing Hagar's son cradled lovingly in Abraham's strong arms, didn't experience the peace and satisfaction she had expected. Instead, she felt sharp pangs of jealousy cutting through her heart like a knife, accompanied by deep emotional pain and gnawing insecurity about her own place in Abraham's affections. That idea she herself had originally suggested in her desperation, giving her personal servant to her husband to conceive a son through her, now turned against her with devastating force like a double-edged sword that wounded the one who wielded it. The son, who had previously represented a practical solution to their childlessness problem, now loomed as a direct threat to her future security and status. The simmering conflict between the two women, which had already been tense and uncomfortable for months, suddenly became completely unbearable and unsustainable. Hagar, though she was now a mother blessed with divine promises and heavenly assurance, still found herself being treated as inferior, still regarded as the other woman, still living in the painful shadow of rejection and barely concealed contempt from the woman who ruled the household. She continued existing as the other woman, forever trapped in that painful designation that followed her like a haunting shadow wherever she went within Abraham's expanding household. She lived perpetually under the dark cloud of rejection, enduring both the subtle whispers and the not-so-subtle displays of contempt that reminded her daily of her lowly status in the eyes of those around her. Motherhood, which she had hoped would finally protect her from emotional pain and grant her some measure of respect and security, hadn't shielded her from suffering as she had desperately wished it would. In fact, in many unexpected and heartbreaking ways, becoming a mother had actually intensified her anguish and deepened her wounds, because when the Almighty begins the sacred process of fulfilling His divine promises in our lives, often the enemy of our souls strategically sows seeds of confusion, discord, and chaos specifically designed to steal away our peace, rob our joy, and undermine our faith in God's goodness. But Hagar, despite facing constant rejection from those who should have welcomed her, enduring daily mistreatment that wore down her spirit, and receiving glances charged with bitter contempt that cut through her heart like sharp daggers, absolutely refused to break under the crushing weight of her circumstances. She sustained herself with every ounce of strength she possessed, clinging desperately to her precious son as if he were the very last spark of life flickering within her weary soul, the only thing keeping her from complete despair. Ishmael had become her safe refuge in the storm, her compelling reason to keep breathing each day, her powerful driving force that pushed her forward when everything else urged her to give up entirely. Through this miraculous child, her entire existence acquired fresh new purpose and profound meaning that transcended her difficult circumstances. She was no longer simply another nameless servant shuffling through her duties in Abraham's camp. She had been transformed into something infinitely more significant, a mother blessed by heaven itself. She was the chosen bearer of a son who possessed a name that boldly called out a fundamental divine truth that echoes through all of eternity. God listens to the cries of His people. That sacred name given by Abraham with divine inspiration wasn't merely a simple label casually attached to identify a child. It stood as a powerful affirmation straight from heaven's throne room, a spiritual mark of divine favor, a constant reminder that even when everything around us violently shakes and threatens to crumble, even when we find ourselves rejected by society, invisible to those in power, or cruelly humiliated by our circumstances, the God of the universe listens every prayer too, and not only does He listen with compassionate ears, but He also acts on our behalf, sustains us through impossible situations, protects us from harm, and accompanies us through every valley we must walk. Hagar and Ishmael's unfolding story was never easy or comfortable to live through. It remained consistently a story marked by painful conflict, deliberate exclusion from the inner circle, and constant tensions that weren't openly spoken about but could be felt intensely in every gesture, every glance, every interaction within the camp. However, in the very midst of their ongoing pain and suffering, the faithful God never once let go of their hands, never abandoned them to walk their difficult path alone through the wilderness of rejection. Even during those long seasons when they seemed to be relegated to the margins of the main storyline, pushed to the sidelines of what appeared to be the central divine plan, he continued working tirelessly on their behalf, sometimes in complete silence that tested their faith, but always remaining present, always consoling their broken hearts, always guiding their uncertain steps, always sustaining them through impossible circumstances, because that's exactly how our God operates. He remains utterly faithful even when the world around us proves faithless. He stands firm and unshakable, even when our circumstances change dramatically and unpredictably. And that unwavering divine faithfulness became even more crystal clear and undeniably evident when in the pivotal 17th chapter of Genesis, the Lord chose to speak once again directly with Abraham in a conversation that would reshape everything. Abraham was already an older man by this time, his once strong body noticeably aged and worn down by decades of waiting, his weary gaze reflecting the countless years of hoping, believing, and sometimes doubting. But in that extraordinarily sacred moment when heaven touched earth, God graciously renewed his ancient promises and did so in a way that absolutely no one could have expected or anticipated. He not only powerfully reaffirmed that Sarah, yes, that same barren woman who had struggled with infertility for decades, that elderly woman who had completely lost hope of ever experiencing motherhood, would miraculously give birth to a son in her advanced age. He not only definitively confirmed that this promised son would be named Isaac, destined to become the covenant's rightful heir, the chosen channel through which all divine promises would be fulfilled in their most direct and complete form. He also made abundantly clear something even more remarkable and unexpected, that he hadn't forgotten about Ishmael either, because the God of Abraham isn't like mortal men who forget their promises or change their minds. He doesn't forget those he has chosen, doesn't discard people when they become inconvenient, and doesn't cast aside those who might seem secondary or less important from a human perspective. And when faced with Abraham's heartfelt, desperate plea concerning his beloved son Ishmael, the Lord responded with a promise that was simultaneously powerful, breathtakingly beautiful, and eternally significant. He declared with divine authority, "I have heard your earnest petition concerning Ishmael, and I am moved by your father's heart. I will abundantly bless him, make him incredibly fruitful, and multiply his descendants greatly beyond what you can imagine. He will become the father of 12 mighty princes who will rule over vast territories, and I will make him the founder of a great and influential nation that will impact history for generations to come." Genesis 17:20. These weren't merely comforting words spoken to ease a father's worried heart. They also permanently sealed Ishmael's destiny with heaven's own seal of approval. They gave him unshakable identity rooted in divine purpose, granted him meaningful purpose that would outlast his lifetime, and secured him a significant place in the unfolding story of redemption. Though he wouldn't carry the specific title of the covenant's son like his future half-brother Isaac, he would forever hold the honor of being the son of a divine promise made by the unchanging God. And for Ishmael, for Hagar, and for all who would come after them, that promise was more than enough. The Almighty God assured Ishmael a brilliant and prosperous future that would exceed all human expectations. He promised him countless descendants who would populate entire regions, guaranteed him leadership that would influence nations, and pledged him greatness that would be remembered throughout history. While many people around them saw him merely as the servant's son, a reminder of human impatience and poor decision-making, heaven itself saw him as a carefully chosen instrument destined to raise up nations and influence the course of human history. The God of the universe doesn't make distinctions or show favoritism according to human lineage, social status, or earthly circumstances. He looks directly at the heart of each individual and faithfully fulfills His word with all those He has personally chosen for His purposes. Though Ismael didn't occupy the center stage spotlight within the specific divine plan that would be revealed through Isaac's lineage, his story was never intended to be merely a footnote or afterthought in the grand narrative. It was a complete line, drawn with divine intention, marked with heavenly honor, and imbued with eternal purpose that would impact countless generations. Despite finding himself in what appeared to be a secondary position from limited human perspective, Ismael was honored directly and personally by the God of the universe with a grandiose blessing that rivaled any earthly inheritance. His destiny wasn't a pale copy or fading shadow of someone else's calling. It was a completely different mission with its own unique significance, but not therefore any less valuable or important in the eternal scheme of things. It was an original story written with the very same ink of divine mercy and unshakable faithfulness that marked every other hero of faith. The sacred promise that the Almighty God made to Ismael wasn't merely an act of fleeting, passing compassion offered in a moment of divine sympathy. It stood as a powerful, resounding declaration that echoed through the corridors of eternity, a living, breathing display of the Creator's magnificently inclusive and perfectly just heart, an eternal reminder carved in stone that the God of the universe doesn't discard, abandon, or forget anyone who calls upon His name. He sees with crystal clarity what others completely ignore or dismiss as unimportant. He listens intently with perfect attention when the entire world falls into deafening silence and turns away. And when He chooses to act on behalf of His people, He does so with perfect justice that rights every wrong, with boundless love that encompasses all of creation, and with eternal vision that sees the end from the beginning and orchestrates every detail for ultimate good. If we take the time to carefully compare and contrast the magnificent promises that were made to Isaac and Ismael, we discover a profound difference that doesn't contradict or compete with each other, but rather beautifully complements and enhances the overall divine narrative in ways that reveal God's infinite wisdom. Isaac was specifically chosen and appointed as the primary channel of the eternal covenant that would shape the course of human history. Through his lineage would be born the nation of Israel, God's specially set-apart people, the sacred lineage of patriarchs who would lead nations, prophets who would speak God's word, and ultimately the long-awaited promised Messiah who would redeem all mankind. Isaac would become the designated bearer of the redemptive spiritual design that God had carefully conceived and planned from before the foundation of the world, carrying within his DNA the genetic and spiritual blueprint for salvation itself. But Ismael, blessed, chosen Ismael, would also rise to become a great patriarch in his own right, not of the covenant people specifically, but certainly of a great and mighty nation that would impact world history. His descendants wouldn't find themselves relegated to history's forgotten margins or pushed to the sidelines of significance. On the complete contrary, they would position themselves firmly at the center of both the ancient and modern world's complex geopolitical stage. His children would form powerful, influential tribes, create rich and diverse cultures, establish influential peoples with legacies that would endure for millennia, developing spirituality and wisdom that would contribute to humanity's understanding of the divine. This remarkable reality reveals a powerful spiritual truth that transforms how we understand God's methods and purposes. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Ismael isn't limited, constrained, or bound by human structures, religious favoritism, or cultural prejudices that divide and separate people. His absolute sovereignty operates effectively through countless different paths simultaneously, weaving together a tapestry of redemption that spans all nations and peoples. He can fulfill His perfect will in various directions at the same time, using different peoples with their unique gifts, different scenarios with their specific challenges, different names with their individual callings, and in absolutely all of them He finds ways to glorify Himself and demonstrate His character. Where our limited human perspective sees rigid hierarchies, painful exclusion, or unfair inequality, God sees divine purpose waiting to unfold, individual destiny preparing to be revealed, and countless opportunities to show His incomprehensible love to a watching world. Isaac and Ishmael's parallel lives represent two distinctly different routes through life. Yes, but both were completely valid paths carefully designed within heaven's perfect blueprint. Isaac earned the title of the covenant's son, while Ishmael became known as the son who was heard by God Himself. Both men, operating within their own unique contexts and circumstances, served as powerful instruments of God's unwavering faithfulness to His people. And this profound truth teaches us something that should transform how we view ourselves and others. Even those individuals whom the world considers outside the main plan, less important in the grand scheme, or second-rate in terms of significance, can be raised up by God to fulfill a greater work than anyone could imagine. The Lord of the universe doesn't need humanity's approval, validation, or permission regarding His sovereign choices. When He makes the decision to use someone for His purposes, He does so completely regardless of their earthly title, their birth circumstances, or their social position. Ishmael's inspiring story demonstrates beyond any doubt that, from what others might consider the periphery, the margins, or the outskirts of importance, God can raise up entire nations, transform whole generations, and write glorious chapters in the book of human history that will be remembered and celebrated for thousands of years. His boundless love recognizes no geographical borders. His perfect plan doesn't operate on a single axis or through one narrow channel, and His amazing grace moves powerfully and effectively even in places where absolutely no one expects to find it working, touching lives and changing destinies in ways that confound human wisdom and reveal divine mystery. And just when the story seemed already full of tension, waiting, and partial fulfillment, came the culminating moment. This wasn't just any moment. It was one of the most transcendental events in all biblical narrative, a sacred turning point. After decades marked by waiting, prayers through tears, silent nights, and worn hope, the promise became reality. Abraham and Sarah, already elderly, saw with their own eyes how what seemed impossible became flesh. What had been announced by God now was held in arms. Sarah, that woman who for years carried upon her shoulders the heavy burden of infertility, a mark that in her culture brought shame and contempt, received in her old age the most absurd news to human eyes. She was going to have a son, a 90-year-old woman with tired body, with aged dreams, and yet God said, "It's time." Sarah's reaction was profoundly human. She didn't throw herself to the ground screaming with joy. She didn't begin prophesying. Her laughter was the sigh of a woman who had already learned not to get her hopes up too much. It was the bitter cackle of one who had already buried her longings. In her heart she thought, "After I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord, also being old?" Genesis 18:12. It was the laughter of one who has lived years with disappointments, of one who has loved God but secretly feared He wouldn't respond. But God didn't get angry with her, and in that weary heart there still remained something valuable, a spark of faith, fragile, almost extinguished, but alive. And God, who is expert at lighting fires with ashes, breathed upon that spark, and the promise was fulfilled. The day came. The miracle manifested in perfect time. Sarah's barren womb opened like a flower defying winter. The child was born. Isaac came into the world, and with him a powerful current of emotions flooded Abraham and Sarah's tents. Everything that had been repressed for years now flowed without restraint. A baby's cry replaced the echo of silence that had dominated their home for decades. The promise that one which seemed impossible was finally being held in the arms of a mother who no longer expected anything and now had everything. Sarah no longer laughed with skepticism. Now her laughter was a song, a celebration, a testimony, and she said with joy, "God has made me laugh, and everyone who hears will laugh with me." Genesis 21:6. That phrase wasn't poetry. It was liberation. It was redemption. It was a wound healed with joy. Her laughter had changed tone. It was no longer bitter, no longer a barrier. Now it was laughter that connected everyone with the miracle. Isaac, whose name every time laughter, his name was pronounced, wasn't named, it was remembered randomly. That God is faithful, that what man considers ridiculous or impossible is for God only the beginning. Isaac was more than a son. He was a living altar, evidence that God fulfills every word, though it takes years, though the body ages, though logic says there's no longer possibility. That child Isaac wasn't solely the fulfillment of an ancient promise. He was much more than that. He was a living declaration that God doesn't lie, that God doesn't forget, and that God isn't late. Though many times it seems he is, Isaac was tangible proof that when the Creator says something will happen, neither time, nor age, nor human logic, nor medical diagnoses can prevent it. He is the God who opens closed wombs, who ignites hope in weary hearts, and who fulfills his word even when everything around says it's impossible. Isaac was that laughter that springs from the soul when one has cried so much they no longer believed they could smile again. Sarah wasn't only the receiver of a biological miracle. She was also a woman who dared to live the profound joy that comes when one abandons themselves completely to faith, when they stop controlling, planning, understanding, and simply believe. Isaac's birth was the glorious culmination of a divine covenant, yes, but it was also the inauguration of a new chapter in salvation history. Through him, the promises given to Abraham began taking visible form. Isaac was the foundation of Israel's nation, but he was also the seed that with centuries' passage would lead to the total fulfillment of God's redemptive plan for all humanity. But, as often occurs in human stories, joy came accompanied by new conflicts. With time's passage, the family dynamic within Abraham's home became tense and delicate. Ismael was already a young man, Isaac barely a child. But the differences between them weren't just age. They were sons of the same father, yes, but born from completely different contexts. And that difference, though not their fault, became a constant source of friction, jealousy, and rivalry. The promises linked to each were different. The mother's treatment was distinct, and in that house the people's gaze was unequal, equally dwelt, peace began breaking. In Genesis 21:9-10, a key moment is narrated. Sarah, observing Ismael's behavior, noticed the young man was mocking her little son, Isaac. Perhaps it was a haughty look, a sarcastic word, a hurtful gesture. We don't know for certain. But what we do know is that for a mother like Sarah, who had waited an entire lifetime to see her son born, "Cast them out," too much, she said. "Cast out this servant and her son, because this servant's son shall not inherit with my son, with Isaac." It wasn't a casual comment. It was a resounding decision, a boundary marked with fire. Sarah's words were the explosion of accumulated years of pain, insecurity, tension between two women who shared more than a home. They shared the same man's life. Sarah's petition wasn't just impulsive, it was emotional, yes, but also strategic, because though she knew Abraham loved Ismael, she also knew God's promises passed through Isaac. She wasn't willing to risk the covenant son's future for the presence of a young man who, though innocent in many senses, represented a time of human disobedience. And so, in the midst of a home divided by jealousy, promises, and human emotions, God still had control. The rivalry between Ishmael and Isaac wasn't a simple conflict between brothers. It wasn't just the result of different characters or childish disagreements. It was the visible manifestation of much deeper tension, a mixture of social expectations, unhealed wounds, maternal jealousy, and above all, the unfathomable mystery of divine plans. Hagar, that Egyptian servant who had already been humiliated once and sent to the desert, was again facing the abyss of rejection. She had obeyed, had returned, had raised her son under the same roof as Sarah, but now she again found herself before the possibility of losing everything, not only her home, not only her security, but also the only being who gave meaning to her life. Her son, Ishmael, for his part, carried a stigma he never chose, the slave's son. Though he carried Abraham's blood in his veins, though he had been raised by the same patriarch who now celebrated Isaac, he would always be for many the one who was left over, the one who shouldn't be there. And though Abraham loved him sincerely, Sarah's pressure, the weight of prophetic destiny surrounding Isaac, and the need to protect the covenant's lineage put the father in a heartbreaking position. Abraham, with his soul torn to pieces, made the most difficult decision of his life. He prepared some bread, a skin of water, and with that simple but painful gesture, said goodbye to Hagar and his son. There were no speeches, no long farewells, only the silence of a broken heart. The scene wasn't just a departure. It was a separation with open wounds, an emotional cut, a spiritual fracture. Hagar left, but not like that time she fled from pride. This time she left with a crushed heart. The desert received them like a wild beast, without shade, without direction, without guarantees. The implacable heat, infinite sand, and scorching sun were their new companions. Water began running out, bread finished. Hope crumbled like dust under their feet. Anguish became unbearable. Hagar, seeing her son weakening, that he no longer had strength to continue, that his breath was short and his gaze dim, did the only thing she could. She laid him in the shade of a bush, seeking at least to give him some relief. Then she moved away. Not from lack of love, but because she couldn't bear to see him die. She sat at some distance, perhaps closed her eyes, perhaps covered her ears, and there, broken, without resources, without hope, she released the rawest cry that can come from a mother's soul. She cried, screamed, collapsed, and cried out to a God who at that moment seemed as distant as the horizon. A God who in his silence seemed to have forgotten them. But she wasn't alone. Genesis 21:17 reveals one of the most moving divine interventions in all Scripture. In the darkest moment, when everything seemed lost, the Bible says, God heard the boy's voice, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Don't be afraid, because God has heard the boy's voice from where he is." It wasn't chance, wasn't coincidence. It was a direct heavenly response to desperate crying. God didn't just listen. He acted because that's how he is. The God who descends to where we are, who bends down to speak to us when we no longer have strength to look to heaven. The angel didn't come with reproaches or condemnation. He came with tenderness, with compassion, with clear direction. He didn't just speak to Hagar as a mother. He spoke to her as a daughter, as a woman who had been wounded but not forgotten. And in that heavenly encounter he gave her a renewed promise. Not diffuse hope, not symbolic comfort, a firm word. "Arise, lift up the boy, and hold him with your hand, because I will make him a great nation." That command wasn't just practical instruction. It was spiritual reminder. My purpose over him hasn't expired. What I have written about Ishmael is still valid. Then something changed. Hagar lifted her eyes. She no longer had them on earth, in desperation, in pain. Now she turned them back to heaven, and in doing so, she saw it. A spring in the middle of the desert. Between cracks of dryness and despair, God had provided water. It wasn't just water for the body. It was water for the soul. It was life. It was renewal. It was the sign that the same God who found her years back in her first desert remained faithful. The spring wasn't there by accident. It was a promise made visible, an eternal symbol that when we believe there's no way out, God opens paths where there's nothing. Where others only see death, He puts sources of life. Hagar and her son drank. Their bodies strengthened. Even more powerful. Their faith was revived. That drink of water didn't just hydrate their lips, it restored their hope. And it was there, in the desert's silence, that Hagar understood with all her being that the God who saw her the first time, who heard her cry when she was alone and pregnant, remained the same. The God who sees, the God who hears, the God who responds. While Ismael drank from the spring, Hagar felt a deep wave of gratitude, a torrent of clean and sacred tears, because she knew, without the slightest doubt, that though she had been despised by men, she had been embraced by the universe's creator. That moment in the desert wasn't just a moving scene. It was a watershed in Hagar and her son's history. It marked a before and after. From then on, the desert stopped being a symbol of defeat to become an altar. It was no longer solely land of suffering, but the place where God came down to console, speak, and renew hope. What seemed the cruelest end, certain death, abandonment, tearful goodbye, was actually the starting point of a new story. A story written by the hand of the God who transforms deserts into gardens, who makes water spring where there are no wells, and who uses pain as raw material to reveal His glory. That desert, which at first was the scene of crying, rejection, and silence, became a holy place, because there, where everything seemed lost, God manifested Himself. And Hagar understood it, felt it with all her being. Her life and Ismael's weren't an accident. They weren't adrift or subject to destiny's whim. They were in the hands of a God who doesn't just promise but also fulfills, and does so in His time, in His way, in supernatural forms that often take us by surprise. And just as God had promised, Ismael grew strong, upright, and resistant. His character was forged by blows of sun, wind, and sand. The desert, that place which had threatened to destroy them, became his life school. There was where he learned everything: to read climate changes, find water between cracks, hunt in silence, move intelligently among endless dunes. But beyond the physical, it was his mother's love that molded him. That woman who had cried in solitude but never gave up became his guide, his protector, his teacher. She taught him to resist, but also to trust. She showed him that true strength isn't measured by muscles, but by faith that remains firm in the midst of chaos. From very young, Ismael showed unique abilities for nomadic lifestyle. The desert didn't break him. It made him wise, made him astute, turned him into a survivor, yes, but also into a leader. A man who knew how to move among scarcity without losing his dignity. His bow skill became legendary. He became an exceptional archer. His aim was precise, his focus unshakable. But beyond the practical, the bow symbolized his character. Tense but firm, subjected to pressure but always directed with purpose. Each arrow he shot didn't just seek food. It was silent testimony that the slave's son had survived, that the God who saw him born had also sustained him, that in the midst of human forgetfulness, he was living under divine promise. In Genesis 21-20, we read a brief phrase, but charged with impressive spiritual force. And God was with the boy, and he grew. He dwelt in the desert and became an archer. Few words, but it wasn't just that Ismael survived divine faithfulness. It was that God was with him from birth. From the cry that broke silence in a humiliated servant's womb, God's hand never departed from him. He cared for him in abandonment, formed him in the elements, accompanied him when there was no house or father, sustained him in desert solitude. And there, on that arid terrain without human promises, the Lord was preparing him for something greater. Ishmael matured. He became a strong, wise man, forged by experience and adversity, and when he reached appropriate age, his mother, who knew him like no one else, understood she couldn't leave his destiny to chance. Hagar, a woman of vision, knew her son's life couldn't continue marked by isolation. It wasn't enough to resist. Now it was time to build. She desired for Ishmael not just survival, but fullness. She wanted him to have a family, his own home, a companion who would embrace him in his victories and sustain him in his battles. And so, moved by love and wisdom, she chose an Egyptian wife for her son. That choice wasn't an unimportant detail. It was a symbolic and prophetic act. In choosing a woman from her own people, Hagar was building a bridge between past and future. She was uniting the Egyptian lineage she carried in her blood with the Abrahamic heritage Ishmael bore by two worlds. Egypt, with its millennial history and cultural richness, and the desert where God had spoken, promised, and fulfilled. It was a marriage that didn't just look toward the future, but honored origin. Ishmael's marriage marked the beginning of a new stage in his life. He was no longer just the servant's son, nor the young man who survived rejection. Now he was a complete man, with roots, with identity, with a legacy to form. He became founder of a house, of a tribe, of a story, and that story was just beginning. Ishmael was more than an archer. He was a leader in formation. The desert's harshness had prepared him to guide, to resist, to sustain. And God, faithful to his promise, blessed his descendants. From him arose 12 tribes, 12 clans that would expand throughout the Middle East, forming an essential part of the region's biblical and cultural history. These tribes, known as the Ishmaelites, weren't minor figures. They played important roles in multiple biblical narratives, each tribe with its name, its language, its traditions, each one a reflection of the fulfillment of the promise made by God to Hagar and her son. Ishmael's story isn't a footnote in the Bible. It's clear testimony of how God's promises extend even to those who seem outside the scene's center. His life was a symbol of strength, resilience, he wasn't simply and the slave's faithfulness. He was a man who carried upon his shoulders a spiritual and cultural legacy that would endure. And though Isaac was the covenant's son, the relationship between him and Ishmael holds a profound lesson. Genesis 25:9 shows us an impactful moment. Both brothers, after all the conflict, after all the years, reunite to bury their father Abraham in Machpelah Cave. That act wasn't just filial duty. It was a moment of reconciliation, a sign that beyond jealousy and differences, family bonds can heal. Abraham's burial marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of another. It was a closure full of meaning. The patriarch who had believed against all hope, who had trusted in God's promises, was bid farewell by the two sons who embodied two distinct but equally blessed roots. Ishmael and Isaac, though they grew in very different contexts, found common ground in an event that marked them profoundly: their father Abraham's burial. In that solemn moment, both recognized something essential, that despite differences, they shared the same inheritance. That act of silent union revealed that even in the midst of rivalries and emotional distances, blood ties have a power that cannot be denied. They can build bridges where before there were walls. This episode suggests that God in His sovereignty can guide hearts toward reconciliation in the most unexpected moments. The Bible is full of these family tensions, promises, jealousy, conflicts, and also forgiveness. From the promises given to Abraham to the stories of his children and grandchildren, each generation was molded by these profound bonds. Ishmael and Isaac's story reminds us that division isn't always permanent. that when God's purpose manifests, even what seems irremediable can heal. With time's passage, Ishmael's descendants expanded and formed powerful tribes. The Ishmaelites became an integral part of God's people's historical fabric. Relations between Ishmaelites and Israelites influenced the region's politics, culture, and religion for centuries. Ishmael wasn't just a secondary figure in biblical narrative. He was a patriarch, a man chosen to be father of nations. His relevance is indisputable. Ishmael is recognized as the ancestor of many Arab peoples. His story directly connects Judeo-Christian traditions with the Arab world. Within Judaism and Christianity, he's seen as the slave's son, the secondary branch of Abraham's inheritance. But God didn't forget him. He made specific promises to him, assuring him that from him too would arise a great nation, and that promise was fulfilled. The Ishmaelites didn't just exist, they flourished, became influential, strong, nomadic, resistant tribes. Their culture intertwined with many others, giving rise to rich heritage that still resonates today. In Islam, Ishmael is seen not as a minor character, but as prophet and example of obedience. He's venerated for his faith, his willingness to submit to God's will, and for his capacity to survive in adverse circumstances. For the Arab world, Ishmael is more than a name. He's identity. He's root. He's pride. Many consider themselves his direct descendants, and his story remains alive in families, customs, and the faith of millions. He's a deep bond between cultures and religions. Today, both Judaism and Islam are living expressions of the lineages that arose from Abraham. Judaism is based on the Torah and Mosaic law, Islam on the Quran and Prophet Muhammad's teachings. These differences have profoundly influenced how both communities see the world, relate to each other, and understand their role in history. Unfortunately, with time, tensions between Jews and Arabs intensified. Questions of identity, territory, and power fed promises that originally should have united became battlefields. Israel's creation in 1948, the Arab-Israeli wars, and continuing conflict with Palestine are examples of how rivalry between Abraham's children still impacts modern history. But these divisions, though painful, don't reflect God's heart. From creation, God's desire has been clear: peace, unity, reconciliation. He wants nations to live under his sovereignty and harmony. The fractures between Abraham's descendants are a result of human condition, not divine plan. Throughout Scripture, God constantly reveals his desire to restore what was broken. In Genesis 12:3, God tells Abraham, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and in you all families of the earth shall be blessed." That promise wasn't for one tribe alone. It was for all nations. God longs for all peoples to reconcile his love with him crosses and borders, among themselves, languages, and cultures. Therefore, in times of conflict, this truth should guide us. Unity and love remain God's eternal purpose. Jesus, the fulfillment of that blessing promise, made it clear in Matthew 5-44. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That radical call is an invitation to leave behind inherited hatreds and see others with compassion. It challenges us to build bridges, not walls, to seek what unites us, not what separates us. The future vision we find in Revelation 7:9 is clear and glorious. I saw a great multitude that no one could count, from all nations, tribes, peoples, and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. This image isn't utopia. It's God's will, a human family reunited worshiping as one voice. Each of us has power God is writing, an agent of change. Each of us is invited to be part, by practicing love, compassion, and forgiveness in our daily lives. In Romans 12:18, Scripture exhorts us with clarity. If possible, as far as it depends on you, live in peace with everyone. This instruction isn't optional. It's a direct invitation to assume peace as shared responsibility. Living in harmony doesn't always depend on others. Many times, though the world is marked by divisions, conflicts, and historical wounds, we're called to be bridge builders, not wall raisers. Looking toward the future, it's vital to remember that though human conflicts may persist, God's plan is greater than any division. He's a God of hope, of restoration, a Father who longs to see His creation united by love. The promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael aren't simply ancient narratives. They're living witnesses of God's faithfulness and His continuing commitment to guide us toward true peace. May these truths inspire us. May they push us to act with humility, to extend our hand instead of pointing, to seek reconciliation where others only see separation. Through prayer, mutual understanding, and actions guided by love, we can contribute to that divine plan's realization. A reconciled humanity, where all nations, peoples, and languages unite in worship to the Creator. And we, you and I, are part of that story. If this video touched your heart and helped you see God's plan with greater clarity, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and click on one of the videos that will appear on your screen. There you'll find more powerful teachings, profound biblical revelations, and messages that will build your faith. Thanks for joining us. May God bless you abundantly.